So now we're going to go up the hill and stop at sort of key points, like the range that Makari said they should be firing at, what the point blank range, and just work our way back up until we might get an idea of where the Jacobites were when they started.
In the 17th and into the 18th century, formal training was starting to happen to all of the armies all over Europe. And remember, Makari had been fighting in Europe, so he was coming down, he was passing these ideals and the things he'd learned onto his junior commanders. So even simple things like measuring distance. Today, as young infantrymen, one of the first things you learn is measuring distance. You need to know distances because you know what? You're going to fire pistols, which only have a certain effective range, then you're going to fire rifles, then machine guns, you're going to throw grenades. You need to know how far you can throw that grenade, etc, etc. And these guys will have probably been doing exactly the same. Basic infantry training right from 17th into the 18th century.
You know, assuming that he's had the ability to choose his ground to some extent, or what he would be aware of in terms of musket fire and what he would be looking at in terms of the landscape and where he could make most effective use of his troops. That's point blank range is when the musket ball, if you're flying parallel, I'll explain this, but if you're flying parallel to the slope, this is when the musket ball will hit the ground.
But point blank range to me means there.
That's right. This is the definition I've seen, is point blank ranges, because they had no sights obviously on the musket, so they were firing as they see it. So when they're firing it, they're firing parallel to the slope, assumably, and that is when the ball will drop. That's when
so that's the end of. That's when it hits the ground.
That's right.
So anything beyond that, they'd have to lob it.
Then they would have to be compensating in their sighting.
Again, it comes back to basic infantry training at different ranges. You know, that's why when we learn to shoot our weapons on ranges, we have 100 meter, 200, 300, 400. Yeah. So at 100 meters, I will be aiming straight at that little area there, and I'll be hitting your dead center. But at 200 meters, I will have to aim a little higher, 3, 4, 5.
But they didn't. Musket. I think these musket. They wouldn't have known about that, or if they knew about it, it wouldn't have been possible. Okay. 2 Men in the Trench, they tried firing musket shots themselves to see how well they could do. They had someone from the War Museum, I believe, who knew about musket firing. They all tried, and at 100 meters, they weren't getting anywhere near.
No, you wouldn't. No. Like I said earlier, 50, 60 yards, that's about your range.
Yeah. But the other interesting thing about the 2 Men in the Trench trial with muskets, they used pig carcasses, and the musket balls went straight through.
That's right. Yeah.
Bone and flesh. There was no deflection whatsoever, and there was no crushing on the musket ball.
No,
it just went through intact.
The only thing they said is that you could sometimes perhaps see the imprint of what it had struck. So cloth, you might get the imprint of cloth, so where it's splatter shot.
Presumably, if it hit a weapon or something like that, it might have splattered a bit.
Or even just a stone in the ground, I guess, is the other option. Explaining two concepts that we have to understand in this terrain, I believe. One is here on the top, where we have what they call the grazing angle, and this is where the person who's shooting is firing parallel to the slope. And here you see the trajectory of the musket ball, as it would initially go very straight, and then due to gravity and air resistance, it would drop down. And this is point blank range.
And that's 200 meters.
That's around 180 meters, yeah. The other concept you have, and this is actually quite important on this site, because you're firing up a hill. So if you don't put your troops in the right position, you could end up where the troops are firing in what is called plunging shot. So if they had a man coming down the hill, to hit him, he would have to elevate his sights to have a chance of hitting him. And what happens in between is that at any other troops in between, the musket ball would go over their head. So because of the inaccuracy of the musket...
So just to confirm, on grazing fire, they would be able to hit anyone that's in this line. So even if you don't get your target, you're very likely to get someone else.
So this is with the troops in position.
Right.
So if you have grazing fire, even if you're aiming at the guy at the front, you've got a good probability the musket ball is going to travel on and hit multiple targets. Or if you don't even hit him, you know.
Yeah.
And like you were saying earlier, you know, the tests they've shown is that the musket ball would more than likely travel through a person and hit another person behind. So if you look at the concept here, the chance of hitting a mass rank of people coming down the slope compared to if you have plunging fire.
And the government army are in 3 ranks?
3 ranks.
3 ranks. And each rank is firing?
No. Basically, my understanding is here they had what they call platoon fire.
Yep.
So instead of like in Zulu, they fired first rank, second rank, third rank. Here, the platoon fire was a clump of men within the line.
My understanding is the regiment would be broken up into, let's say, 12 units.
Yeah.
And the numbering, let's say for simplicity, is 1 to 12. So number 1 would fire and number 7 would fire.
At the same time.
At the same time. 2 and 8, 3 and 9.
And there's sometimes even a senior NCO would give the order, because that bunch of 30 men there are being attacked very quickly by moving targets.
Yeah.
Before we go on campaign, Iraq, Afghanistan, Northern Ireland, wherever, you constantly, before every tour, you retrain, and one of the things you retrain on is firing at moving targets.
Yeah.
Vehicle mounted, running men,
yeah.
Because it's very, very difficult hitting a moving target, even if they're coming straight at you. Because remember, they're not running in a straight line either. They can see rocks and things, and they're like, and you try shooting somebody at like 100 paces, doing that.
Yeah. So presumably,
and those bloody muskets are heavy.
They were heavy, but the interesting thing for me is in these blocks of men, whatever we call them, platoons or companies, there's a group of men, and they were being given the order to fire by a junior officer or an NCO or whatever. They were firing all together. So when he said there's 20 men there, he's saying fire.
Yeah.
So they were aiming
that
and
would
firing.
make sense.
All
because of
together,
the laws
the
of
block.
average,
Yeah.
20 musket balls, you're going to take maybe 4, 5, 6.
Yeah.
Down.
The other thing they said was the regiments, they had drummers. So commands were given by drums.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go for the next. So what are we going to do here?
Okay, the other thing is just to explain what I presented just now is rather simplistic, of course, but what I have done is I've had a look at some of the positions, and this is sort of illustrated here. This was to do with Lieven's troops, which are further down here, and I had a look at what would happen if they were positioned much further down towards the Gary. And this shows you that they end up with what is plunging fire. So if they were firing at troops within the sort of designated 80-meter distance from their front line, what would happen is it would actually travel over the top of other troops between. So you end up with ineffective fire. So, but if we move Lieven's troops up to a position where they can fire parallel to the slope and have grazing fire, then this is a situation where they can fire through all the advancing enemy and have a much greater chance of hitting something.
And is that what this line shows? Is that the position?
That's part of the basis of how I've come up with this new line. So we've got the anchoring point, which is on the knoll. We've got the trajectories. We know where the musket balls are fired. We are making the assumption that the Makari has placed his troops and that he's placed them so that they can have grazing fire. And people are often citing this as to how many shots they got off. And he's saying we fired no more than 3 shots apiece. So a piece, I would guess, was a company.
Yeah.
And
During the whole battle.
During the whole battle.
Mm.
So some of them would have been plunging fire.
So some of those would have been plunging fire, presumably.
Other distant Highlanders,
Yeah. They continue to be deadly at quite extreme ranges.
Yeah, definitely.
And what D.P. Miller showed in his thesis was that they could get as much as 900 meters, but with extreme firing at extreme elevation.
And if that musket ball is bouncing off something metallic or a rock and shattering, and
that's what he says. Is
shrapnel.
actually they tend to bounce as well.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting because if you look at the changing to Battle of Trafalgar, that's what Nelson did. He bounced them off the water, didn't he?
He did, yes.
To
When the enemy were heeling over.
Yeah.
So then the shot would come up and hit the
Underneath.
Yeah.
Explain something
I want to
else on
explain
this.
something about this because
Okay.
what we've got here is this is the boggy ground. This is where we think Makari was stationed. And now we have these two distributions of shot. We have this blue one which goes almost all the way up the hill here. We have the red one which goes to the limit of the archaeology. So it's quite possible there is more in this area above here. And this indicates that, you know, the government troops are firing at someone coming down the slope. But what you're seeing here is the archaeology goes all the way down, and there is a quite definite cut-off here where we're no longer seeing any musket shots. So to me, what this says is that the government line was somewhere in here, because we know that, if you remember the previous illustrations, they're aiming at the 80-meter mark. The muskets are obviously not going to hit the ground in front of them, because there's going to be a certain distance in between, and this is where the musket balls start to fall. So it's travelling. If you look at this,
so going to that one, where's our house? That just shows where we are on the battlefield.
Our house is down here.
Okay.
Down here. This is the outline of the new garden of our house. If you look at the top one, this is in this space in here is this gap. You know, this is the 80 meters where they're starting to open fire. We can be quite sure musket balls from this position are not going to hit the ground. So this is the gap that you get in front of the troops, and if we use that geometry, we can then start saying that the troops were positioned in a location like this, which is consistent with what we saw here. And this sort of governs where I'm putting the line. So we have the line starting at the knoll, coming down through a position in front of these musket balls here and here, and going through this area here where we reckon the left wing of Makai's group were.
So if you look at your top diagram, these musket balls are there basically at the end of this point.
Yeah, so there will be a variation because the slope is not perfect slope.
Yeah.
So depending on when they were firing in the sequence, depending on the charge, depending on the musket itself, you know, there's a lot of variation. So there will be a lot of variation due to other factors than the firing angle.
Yeah.
And what's the consensus of opinion about how many volleys the government army released?
Well, I think the maximum was what McBain, he said 3, but we suspect that that's possibly including the initial volleys that they had at the very beginning.
Before the long-range shots.
So if you think 80 meters, the distance, how long it takes for someone to cover from 80 meters to hitting you, and they all say how quickly the Jacobites came on. You know, that's everything that's fairly consistent in all the accounts.
From 80 meters away in this terrain.
And to reload them, it was a firelock at that time. Yeah. To reload it was a wooden ramrod, right? And the manuals reckon 60 seconds.
So no chance.
So the whole idea of platoon firing was when your platoon 1s and 2s, or 1 and 7 fired, they were reloading. And then 2 and 3 or whatever, and by that time they were reloaded and back again.
And we know the wooden ramrods used to snap.
They did. And they also said the muskets were extremely unreliable. They said as many as 1 in 3 shots didn't go off. So all pretty precarious stuff.
Well, you see that as soldiers here, don't they? When they use the firelocks and they don't go off. You know, half of them having to.
I think one of the big advantages that Makari had that day was it was dry. Because if it had been raining, even less would have gone off. Okay, so where are we going to go now?
So now we're going to sort of work our way up. I'll set up the first stop point. This position is when the pistols, this is the effective range of a pistol.
Which is how many meters?
30 meters.
From that flag there?
Yeah. 70.
It's very difficult to get a good little tight group on it.
Okay, 80.
And that's not very far.
Should we just leave this wheelbarrow?
Yeah.
The wheelbarrow here is the range that Makari ordered his troops to fire. Yeah. And the blue bag down the bottom was the pistol range.
Yeah. So this is 80 and that's 30.
But and to move from there to the line, how long did it take a really fit young man to cover that seconds? Very quick.
And also Lochiel told his men not to fire until the last minute, and he said he was amazed how they held that discipline. Yeah. So I don't know exactly the distance, but Lochiel ordered them to keep running without firing until what you've said, the bended knee thing, fire, and then went on. So
and then would they leave their weapons? And then
yeah.
go into the close combat.
I guess the way they might have known was it's hearing the platoon commanders shouting fire.
Yeah.
And then you drop to your knee when they
Yeah, that's a good point here.
Yeah.
We're now moving up to 150, which is the maximum of effective range. This is to do with accuracy again. So the consensus among authorities at the time, this is the maximum distance at which you might consider to open fire. This is 180 meters. This is the maximum effective range, is what they say.
That's right.
So, if it's 180, could we make an assumption that perhaps the Jacobite line advanced up to this position to be within musket range?
Yeah, I would think so. I think
so. That would also fit with the accounts of them being at the brow of the hill.
What you mean, just in preparation for the final charge?
For the final charge.
It's
still a deadly range though, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
I mean, would they be this close or would they be a bit further back? You know,
interesting.
It's difficult. I mean, we know the musket is deadly to a long range. You're talking 600 meters probably.
Yeah.
But the chances of hitting someone is the question.
An individual.
But a mass rank. A mass rank is very different, of course.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, what is musket range, which is what Lochiel said. Lochiel said Dundee marched his clan troops within musket range. Online there was a debate there, and I think they reckon it was 240 yards musket range.
I could, with practice, from that line, with probably a day, I could start hitting the windows on the ground floor of that house.
With the musket?
Yeah, with conditions like this.
Yeah.
I think this is too close. I mean, Makari would love that because you wouldn't hit individuals, but you just fire into the mass.
Yeah. And the psychological effect as well would be pretty devastating.
So let's walk on up then to 240.
240 grazing fires.
It's light enough.
240 is some people call it point blank range. Okay. And this is.
Isn't it interesting how that's changed?
It is very interesting, yeah. But this is where if they were firing up a perfectly sloping surface, this is where the musket ball would land, with them firing parallel to the surface.
Yeah, from 1.5 meters.
So dropping. This is the drop you get in the musket ball due to gravity and air resistance.
But you look at this surface, not very flat, is it?
No, it's not. Dead ground. Yeah. So they would have been hidden or almost behind. Some of the line. We wouldn't even see some of the line down there. Yeah. So what you can probably start to say here is that these groups represent a particular clan coming down the slope to attack.
Yeah.
And the red one here is, okay, we don't see the full extent of it because the archaeology finished on this sort of brown line here. So in all probability, there are more shots going up the slope.
Yeah.
God, quite a lot of trouble.
I suppose impurities on the musket ball just made them veer.
But they also weren't rifled.
No.
Yeah.
And also DP Miller talks about the fact that the size of the musket ball to the barrel varied.
They were rattling around inside in the barrel. They weren't padded. They didn't use any wadding.
Absolutely, because they said when you use padding, you got much better trajectory and everything else. But if you just put the powder down, the musket ball down, you got a different result. So there are a huge number of variables.
And a lot of troops made their own.
Well, they did, and that all variables.
So different weights would carry it further.
Yeah, and that's part of the reason why they had the plug bayonet, is that the muskets are all different.
Yeah,
they couldn't standardise on a fitting on a ring bayonet.
The only thing that was standard was the whole of the end.
That would fit most muskets.
Because it was tapered. It would fit, a range. Okay, just need to remember that the Highland Jacobite army had left Blair Castle, come round behind the hill of Lude, and we know from Lochiel's account, as they emerged over the hill, they had no sight of the enemy. As they advanced further forward, they saw the enemy below them in the plain. They started and jumped to their feet. Lochiel's words were, but Dundee never halted after they came over the brow of the hill. Dundee never halted his army until they were within musket shot of the enemy.
And it also raises the question about who arrived first, because I think there's some contradiction there, where Makari seems to say that when he arrived they were already in place.
That is interesting. What you've got to remember is that Dundee had sent some troops down the old road, and that Makari had the first position for the government line was actually in a line facing towards Blair Castle.
Which would have made sense if he'd seen the advance party of what he would presume to be the main army behind.
That's right, and that was a feint sent deliberately by Dundee to hold them in this position. He'd chosen this ground, and that, going back to an earlier discussion, is why the Highland Army came behind the Hill of Lude. It was an ambush in a way. They wanted to hold them on this ground and then attack from the high.
And it's quite important because it also, you know, how much time did Makari have to deploy his troops is the question, and how much could he have chosen? I mean, within the limits of what we're saying here, you know, whether he could have, was he really right back on the cliff on that face where all the trees were, or would he have had time to move into a slightly more advantageous position?
Makari tells us he had time to lay his troops out.
Yeah.
And he tells us, you know, once he was down on the flat plain where the steppe ground was, he got them, he didn't want to be trapped there, he got them up there. You've got to remember, all these trees here weren't there. These trees that we see today are there because of the A9. Yeah. And he organised his men on what he considered the best flat plain, and he was very concerned about being flanked. He split his regiments into two, and a line of three deep, which was unusual at that time. Usually it would have been 5 deep.
The interesting thing for me is there's a slight contradiction between Makari's account and Lochiel's account, because if you look at the traditional account of the battle, Makari first lined his men out to face the feint towards Blair Castle.
No sooner did he give him the order than he had to counter it.
But then we see in Lochiel's account, which I just read out, that they were sitting on the ground, because as his men advanced, they jumped and stood to their feet.
What I would say happened there was right from the bottom, they saw them coming over the hill. They weren't in position. Lochiel wasn't with the advance.
Yep.
Yeah. So he then came with the later one, the other regiments. So he's reporting what he saw.
Yeah.
But by that time, because Makari had already seen them coming around here, Makari was the commander, and he got them up onto this place as quickly as he can.
Yeah. So in terms of the Makari's time to dispose of his men, I think that's really quite important. If they were facing the feint first, he then had time to reposition the men on this higher ground all the way down to the Gurneg.
Yeah.
At this point he really became fixated about the risk of being outflanked by this army occupying the higher ground. So I think he had a significant amount of time to refine his positions.
So what's musket shot? The maximum range of a musket is?
Maximum range is 900 metres.
Okay.
So that will put you up beyond the end of the hill there. So I don't think you can say anything in terms of what the maximum range is. Obviously, the accuracy drops off very quickly. We've had the discussion of point-blank range, or when it'll strike the ground. So for snipers who are skilled and can compensate for the drop in the musket, then it becomes possible for them to start firing at the enemy. So that's why we had the discussion about the snipers. So, and you've got to also remember, when the snipers are firing, they're not firing at an individual. They're firing at the barn door, which is the whole.
Unless they're specifically directed at firing at a particular person who, if perhaps Bonnie Dundee is identified, which is still a pretty big challenge from the line back there.
Well, they did identify him.
Yeah, so straight away, you know, the snipers could be ordered to direct the fire onto that commander.
And Makari talked about that as well. He talked about papping shot as he walked around on his.
Shots.
Men were being hit either side of him. He was being missed.
You're off to a good start at the beginning of the battle if you've already killed the enemy commander.
So we're standing here at 240 metres.
Yeah.
Okay. Conjecture it could be further up the hill or further down musket range.
In modern firing, what is the natural human tendency when firing uphill? Would they fire too high or too low?
You talk all about dead ground.
Yeah.
And you're going to fire high.
So they would tend to fire high.
You can aim off depending on the weather. You can hear. I mean, you can feel the wind from the west, as is usual up here.
Yeah.
So I don't know if we know about the wind that day. Probably not the sort of thing that they would have written about. No, but certainly, I personally think, if I'm Bonnie Dundee, I've come across that hill. I'm aware that my skirmishers have reported back saying they're coming through the pass. They might already be out the pass. They might be deploying. You've sent your advance party up as a feint to set the ambush, to slow the army down. The army's conformed to that ambush, and they're thinking, oh my God, form line. We're going to be attacked from the direction of Blair Castle. And then clever Bonnie Dundee marches his army up there, and they will line up straight on that ridge.
Yeah.
right behind us, where, like you said earlier, there'll have bound to be, well, there was an ancient track, and there'll have been some sort of structures there as well.
And they advanced to where, I would say, the logical thing would be they advanced to where they could be seen by the enemy.
Can be seen.
We're now holding them in that position where we want them.
Yeah. And you've got the psyche. It's a bit like you mentioned Zulu. That you know, when the Zulus appear above Rorke's Drift, the psychology on that tiny little unit, seeing lines and lines of the enemy on the high ground, possibly about to charge you and rip you to bits. Fantastic of Bonnie Dundee. I want you all lining up here, you know, to make you look as big an army as possible. Okay, so from a rifleman's point of view, even though we know the Highlander army behind us on the ridge didn't have an excessive amount of muskets, but their accuracy is going to be double that of the musketeers down in the government line firing uphill. Much easier to accurately fire downhill.
Interesting.
That's interesting, because we know that the Highlanders did, they had recognised marksmen in each clan regiment. These were the hunters. So they would have been very chary with wasting shot because they were poor, but they were put in a line and they were asked to shoot from a distance.
And you're in the early days of the evolution of light infantry as well. You can already see the introduction of skirmishers during the 18th, 17th centuries. And these sharpshooters, snipers, whatever you want to call them, nothing to scare them from coming forward 100, 150 paces and taking a more accurate shot, because they're still going to get back to their own line of safety.
And especially if they had any cover.
And there's lots of cover along this side.
So you can imagine if the Highland line was up here, that knoll there would have had people on it taking pot shots, lying down,
I would have been. I'd have been quite happy knowing that government line is rigid down there. I'd have been quite happy with my musket, half a dozen balls, just lying on the ground there, taking shots. I'm going to hit them.
Yeah, you will hit them.
Sharpshooter, I'm going to hit. I'm going to take out casualties. Again, it affects their morale.
And if they send anyone out, you've got plenty of time to go up.
Exactly.
So what we're going to do now is, if we imagine where we're standing is roughly the position the Highland Army would have occupied initially, we're going to walk down towards the government line, shown by the flags there, and then we're going to talk about the different line levels of effectiveness of musket fire. The flags you can see behind us are marking where we are arguing a very likely position for the government line is, starting on the right hand side with the knoll and then moving down towards the right wing of the government army. So those flags mark the government line. We know that on the knoll was occupied by very experienced troops, the Lauder's Regiment, who had been positioned there by General Hugh McKay because of their reliability and experience, and their task was to hold that position and prevent the government from being outflanked. So we have Lauder's Regiment followed by Balfour's Regiment, and we know from the account of the battle from Hugh McKay that at one point Balfour's Regiment had advanced forward towards the government line, and Hugh McKay had to ride to bring them back into line. And this just emphasises that McKay was obsessed with keeping his troops in a straight line.
This is a point blank range, and this is where the musket ball would strike the ground if the government troops are using the grazing angle principle, which we discussed earlier. And that's when they fire parallel to the slope, and this is where the musket ball, due to gravity and wind resistance, air resistance, would strike the ground.
180, I think.
180 metres.
The Jacobite tactics at this stage, this is the early stages of the use of the Highland charge, a very effective tactic, was, remember, the order the Jacobites would have been to stay in their tightly grouped bunches of men. So at the front we had the Dunyo Ursler, the gentlemen of the clan, most heavily armed, and I suspect they wouldn't have been running at this stage, they would have been advancing in a relatively disciplined, tight group of men coming down towards the government line.
It's interesting you say that, because Lochiel said he was 63 years of age, he started running with his men, he was wearing shoes that bit into him, he stopped and took off his shoes, and then he ran barefoot and caught up with his men just after the last volley had been fired.
Yes.
Maximum effective.
And what's maximum effective?
Maximum effective is it's the maximum range where they expect to be able to possibly hit an individual.
But we also know that Makari ordered his troops, his commanders, not to fire until 100 paces.
Yeah.
So it's likely they would have held their fire until the next one.
But this is we're looking from the government troop position, so this is the maximum distance they might have considered open fire. You know, if they had been given the choice.
If they released 2 volleys, I would have thought I'd fire my first volley when the enemy were here.
Makari tells us quite clearly he wanted the Highlanders to meet such a ferocious fire, and for every one of his muskets to be fired, but only to start firing at 100 paces. Because he reckoned if you
possibly have got 2 volleys off them.
No, you couldn't.
From here they wouldn't, though.
No.
The interesting question about the 2 volleys is, was it really 2 volleys, or was it 2 platoons? I noticed.
Yeah, possibly.
Platoon 1, platoon 2.
The other question is, how would if they're coming down in a mass body, what about the men off the side? What would they be doing?
Would they be firing in from the side?
Would they?
I don't know.
I mean, would their training allowed them to have done that?
I think so.
I think so. It's a perfect vantage point, and like we said earlier when we were on the knoll, it's great from a sharpshooter's point of view. You said good quality troops have been put on there, so some of your best marksmen are on there. You're going to be aiming at this Highlander army, you're going to be aiming at the men on horseback, because they're the ones in control and command. That's what they're aiming at.
So where we're standing is the McLeans of Jewett were advancing down. There's a large group of men, one of the well-disciplined Highland forces on the day. How far did the government line could see? Because one of the arguments is the reason they ran is they saw Makari's regiment being decimated.
I think they would see all the way down.
I think they would as well.
I think you could.
Because it's clear, no trees.
Yeah, if there were no trees in that area, I think you would see.
So we know from some of the accounts, I can't remember which one, but we know that the McLean's regiment, the McLeans of Jewett came down first, but we know the Cameron regiment hit Makari's first. So the ground there is slightly steeper, and perhaps they'd advanced a little bit ahead, but anyway, we know that's where the first fighting really took place. And there is an argument to say the left wing of the government army saw their colleagues being decimated in Makari's regiment, and that's when they decided to pull out.
I think the other point that David made when we were doing our video conferencing, was all of this is on the same
contour.
It's about a 10-metre drop.
From one end to the other.
From one end, depending on where you put the 2 flanks, but it's not that far off, you know.
From the Gurneg to So it's not so they're roughly all on a flat plain, which again ties in with what Makari said. And he put them on a plain. Yes, it's not a plain as we see it, but it is all on the same level.
So I always think it's worth imagining yourself now. You're in McLean of Jewett's Red Clan Regiment. You're advancing down. You now hit the spot, David. This is the 100 paces.
This is 100 paces,
So this is where you're now 100 paces from the enemy line.
Which is 80 metres.
80 metres. By this stage, you'd be in full advance mode, moving forward really aggressively, still probably in your tight grouped bunches, but now in the final stages. The only possibility is we do know that in the Highland Charge they could have what was referred to as the bending of the knee, where they would drop down just before meeting the enemy, only to rise up again for the absolute final move forward.
So from here, this is when the fire would be starting to hit the clan regiment.
So the fire is very effective, or it's becoming much more effective at this stage. Men would be falling here. You have to remember that more than 600 Highlanders were killed in the volley fire. So they were taking significant casualties from the government line. So it's worth remembering that there's been a lot of talk about the government troops, large numbers of them being inexperienced, but it's worth noting that the Highlanders, the clan regiments, most of these men in the clan regiment had also never experienced a significant battle like this. Their experience would have been clan skirmishes, cattle raids, that type of thing, but not a major battle. At this distance, 100 paces, this is where Makari had ordered his men to open fire, and so you can imagine that the level of firing from the government line was becoming quite intense at this point. We know that the Dunya Ursula, the gentlemen of the clan, many of them would have been armed with pistols, and Dundee had given them very strict orders to only fire within 20 paces of the enemy. So as we advance, we're still well over that. So by this stage, the Highlanders would probably be in full run, screaming their battle cry, advancing towards the government line. We know actually that Balfour's regiment and some of Lauder's regiment had probably turned and run by this stage. So even though they're closing in on the line, it's quite interesting and useful to think the Highlanders, if we believe Cameron of Lochiel's account, if they held their discipline, they were only firing, starting to probably fire around now, and the bag in front of us marks 20 paces from the government line. So it may be they fired at this point. At this point they went through perhaps the bending of the knee where they dropped, placed their weapons on the ground, drew their swords, placed their chargers in front of them, and then this was the absolute final sprint in towards the enemy.